Had a quorum at the appointed time. The meeting now begins. Thank you for coming. Can we invite the administration team into the room, please?
就之前嘅會議呢，其實呢就係包括聽取團體代表嘅意見呢，政府
Have listened to deputations from other organizations at the previous meeting, and the administration had offered a written consolidated response. As per the chairman's request, the administration had provided a complete written response after the meeting. Please refer to CB bracket 2989/1918 bracket 01, which has been circulated to members prior. Do members have any matters for clarification concerning the government's response? So let's continue our class-by-class scrutiny. Last time, we stopped at part 2 of class 6, Mr. Chukafei. I know there's a mini storage association written to the Bills Committee, but we haven't seen that on the table. We received their letter. Well, since a rather short notice, we don't even have time to table to members. It will be given to the government and the members later, and hope that the administration would give a written response to the views outlined in the letters as well. So can we ask the administration to respond to the letter at the same meeting? Probably not today, probably for later meetings. Okay, let's move on to class by class. Last time we were at class 5, so let's move on to 6. So who in government will take us through? So let me continue. Last time we were at class 5, today we're at class 6. The class 6, well, for the fire safety requirements and concerning the they asked the persons concerned to observe the requirements. There are two types of persons concerned. Well, the occupier of a building, so that the measures outlined will know that who will be responsible. Okay, let's continue if there are no further questions. Thank you, Chairman. For the class 7, 8, 9, well, is demonstrating our flexible and pragmatic approach. It outlined that the enforcement authority, how it should issue the orders. Well, with having regard to the structural integrity of the building or technology available to comply with the requirement. If the requirements of the schedule are unfeasible, there are others alternate solutions. So it shows that the authority are not rigid. It just take in light of the actual circumstances of the building. For 7, so maybe our legal advisor may have some questions for you. For 7C, can you cite some examples of any other relevant factors, quote unquote? And for 7, also mentioned the owner or occupier to take other measures the authority consider appropriate instead of complying with the requirement. So as in other measures, would it be outlined clearly in the FSD? Or should the owner or occupier submit the proposal? So let me explain on a conceptual level, and I will let Mr. Chen to explain what are the other relevant factors. For the other measures, the scenario involves that after the enactment of the ordinance, that before we issue the FSD, the two enforcement agencies will conduct a joint inspection. They will inspect the building circumstances, the structure, and so on. And in the inspection, it has been found that it could not fulfill any requirements in the schedule. So the FSD would then take into account the elements of the building and propose feasible measures which the building can comply with. If the occupier or the owner, upon receipt of the FSD, so they appoint the authorized persons to carry out the works, and found there are some insurmountable obstacles, they can propose to the EA to amend the FSD, which concern the section clause 9. So the two scenarios may be possible. However, as far as FSD is first issued, that we see the actual circumstance after the inspection in issuing FSD instead of complying with the requirement. Mr. Zhang. So the question by the two chairmen, besides 7, the sector integrity and technology available, let's say the building had a very small layout. That's a reasonable ground for them not to comply with the requirement in this schedule. Let's say you have a small floor space, not able to install a huge water tank, and due to this constraint, we can request the building to use a smaller water tank. That's one case in point. And for another question by the chairman, that in the FSD, it has been clearly state the other requirements and instead of having the owner and the occupier propose them themselves. Legal advisor? Members can pay attention to clause 7. The LS Legal Service Division had written to the government, and for the actual operation of clause 7, as concerned as the EAs and the occupier, upon receiving the FSD, what can it do if they found their actual difficulty? And they would be shown through express provision in the clause. Well, our letter is CB5A 3/18/1901, and the response for the government is as CB2770/18/1905. Well, overall speaking, the administration of fuel-free supplement, the government took the view that they hope to take the administrative measure when they have difficulty complying with the requirement. They wish that to comply with the alternative measures. The governments took the view that the administrative mode mature and therefore have worked effectively and are necessary to include express provision. Well, the point here is whether we need to include express provision. Members can consider that when an owner or occupier had received an FSD, there are a series of procedures they have to go through, and they have to contact the EAs, because there also be a deadline, a time limit. So how do we determine that that in implementing FSD, what are the respective responsibilities? So maybe the government can elaborate that by the way of the flexible and pragmatic approach in taking administrative measures. So how do you actually operate? So can you also explain to members how we do it, what it had conceptually, and how to be actually be carried out, in explaining why is it unnecessary to include express provisions? Mr. Chung. So why didn't list out all the other relevant factors in the bill? Well, taking reference from other relevant ordinance, there are a lot that are factors that cannot be fully be accounted for. So therefore, we not able to include all of them in the bill. We would first conduct a preliminary inspection. Then we will issue an FSD. Since the requirements of the FSD are in the schedule, that's a basic requirement, and we will actually look at the building itself, whether there are other factors that prevent them from fulfilling the basic requirements. Well, we will proactively amend or offer alternative measures. And since there are a huge number of buildings involved, and each building are designed differently and different circumstances, therefore we're not able to list out all the other alternative measures. So by taking alternative measures, we regard it as more appropriate. Any follow-up? Okay, let me give you an example. Let's say my only occupier needs to apply to the EAs that I need to take alternative measures to comply with the FSD. We see that in the actual provisions, it didn't outline how a person can initiate the process. I understand that they would deal with it administratively. However, and how can the person make this application? We can't see this in the clause. So maybe the government can see from this angle. So maybe the focus is not that you have to include all the alternative measures, but whether the provision can demonstrate that to limiting the responsibility. So when they need the application, how can they start the application? So what can the administrative measures can be appropriate enough to comply with the requirement?
Mr. Zhang, thank you, Chairman. Well, it works like this. The owner and occupier will only need to comply with the fire safety directions issued by us. If we had set out any other relevant factors, the owner and occupier will still use that as a basis. If the owner believes that they are unable to comply with even the very basic or mild requirements, then they can send in an application to us. Our case officer will follow up on all the cases. The owner can at any time discuss with us on whether requirements could be complied. So this is how we operate right now. Usually the owners will not need to make a special application. They just need to follow the fire safety directions. I think you need to be a bit more clear. Maybe you have to make it clear that for the fire safety directions, you need to give them a timeline or a time frame on when it should be completed. And the owner or occupier may come up with other alternatives. If that is the case, how can you make arrangements? Because that would perhaps take up some time. And ultimately, the owner or occupier would still need to comply with the requirements. Then how, if you've taken up some of their time, then how do you ensure that they'll be able to comply within the time frame? Well, actually, in Clause 8, we listed out the general requirements for the fire safety direction. So we just specify that the time limit must be reasonable. It would depend on what kind of measures the owner and occupier would need to adopt. Let's say they already have certain measures. They just need to make mild changes. Then it would they would only be allowed a very short time. But if it is a complicated procedure, then we would allow a longer time. Well, even if it specified a time limit, if we see the occupier and owner working towards these safety requirements, then we would also allow certain flexibility. Also, there would be a provision that would allow you to amend the time limit. And that is the case, right? Yes, Chairman, you were correct. Clause 9 states that it will be able to amend or withdraw fire safety direction. So if there is a need, then we may from time to time amend the fire safety direction. So the case officer will continue discussions and communication with the owner and occupier, because sometimes there may be issues during the procedure, and they may come back to try to make amendments, or maybe we find that they need more time to complete the procedures. And so under Clause 9, the enforcement authority will have the authority to, from time to time, amend the fire safety direction, because we already believe that we may have to use Clause 9 to help amend or make changes to the specified time limit for compliance. Mr. Wu Jiwei. Thank you, Chairman. Well, there are 2 points I'd like to raise. First, on Clause 7, stating the technology of fire safety requirements, because we've already set out all the standards. But when we're talking about the technology available, how can you make sure that the available technology will comply with the requirement? And how do we understand this term technology here? Well, how do we use it under this? Because you're using fire standards and also on standards made by the buildings department. So, well, it is not very flexible here. So how can you really apply this term technology in complying with the requirements? Another point is a standard on time limit. Let me give you an example. Well, if there would be changes in the future, we would need to come back to amend the legislation, or can it just directly apply? For example, we have a 2019 fire safety standard. Then can we just automatically have it applied to it? Mrs. Liu. Thank you, Chairman. What is listed here is actually on the latest standards, but we understand that standards may be updated. Therefore, we have already listed out that the Secretary for Security can make amendments to Schedule 1 or 2. So when Clause 7 differs from the latest situation, we can consider that through Clause 55, we'll be able to substitute or amend the codes of practice. So this is already listed under Clause 55 bracket 2 that this notice will be subject to the approval of LegCo. So we have already put down this flexibility. Mr. Zhang, thank you, Chairman. Mr. Wu is concerned with the technology. In the schedule, we have listed that we want the standards from 2012. In the future, let's say in 2012, the fire sprinklers has a certain requirement, and maybe in a few years it becomes obsolete. Then we will. Then, because of restrictions in technology, we cannot require the owner or the occupier to use that standard. Therefore, under 7 bracket C will be able to request the owner and occupier to use a different kind of a sprinkler system. Mr. Wu, yes, I'd like to follow up. Well, it's okay. Maybe Mr. James To can speak first. Well, let me set a 3-minute limit. It's all right. Mr. To can ask his question first. Well, my question is very simple. Well, we are now at the most updated version, and the version of 2012. Well, okay, let's say, as you gave the example, the fire sprinkler becoming obsolete. Well, I'm certain, that would be much later in time because we're still using standards made in 2012. But there would not be a certainty under Clause 7. Well, because under 7 bracket C is at any other relevant factors, then it means that if there's nothing more to be done, then there would be judicial proceedings, or maybe you would need to make changes to the legislation. So there is not a certainty here. Well, of course, you would think that this is in the interest of the public. However, the authority here is not very clear. Well, in the past, there is a 525 or 535. Well, you might say that there is an equivalent. Well, that has already been legislated, but if the government has uncertain authority, then I don't think it is appropriate. So how do you really ensure that the relevant factors could be made certain, or at least this is something that the public can trust? Because I think you have to make clear the legislation, because this is too vague here. Thank you, Chairman. Let me try to respond to your question, and then we do have examples to share with you. So Mr. To is asking where the baseline lies. If I could refer you to clause 11, the EAs and the owner and occupier could not come to a consensus. Does it mean that the owner and occupier has already committed an offense? Under clause 11.3, we set out the baseline that if the owner or complier cannot comply, it is because the compliance would pose a risk of prejudicially affecting the structural integrity of the building or part, or because the technology required for compliance is not reasonably available. Then the EAs cannot request the owner and occupier to continue with the directions. So this is the baseline set out under 11(3). We do have the flexibility to ensure that the owners and occupiers could comply with our clauses. Mr. Zhang, well, let me explain that we do have some basic standards that could not be changed by the enforcement authorities. For example, right now in the industrial buildings bill, we do have the basic requirements set out in Schedule 1 and 2. Mr. To asked about Clause 7, that the owners and occupiers could not comply with the fire safety requirement regards to bracket A to 3, and then the occupier and owner would need to adopt other relevant factors. Then if you look at the basic requirement, we request that they would need to comply with the 1994 fire safety standard. So that is the minimum, the basic standard. However, if due to structural integrity and due to lack of technology that they are not able to comply with this basic standard of the 1994 fire safety standards, then the EAs would consider asking for a lesser standard to be complied with.
So for Mr. Wuchiwai or James To, or I could explain. So maybe you could see, can you go back and think how can we close the distance? So according to you, the FSD claims that it will able to comply with a lower requirement. So allow the government can legally, well, in case you can't observe the requirements, I can offer you a lower requirement. Wasn't written in the bill. You're not just saying to me now, well, but in case of JR, we can bring it back up. So what do you mean by higher or lower? So is that do they have expert can claim this is higher or lower? Let's say you have 100 liters now reduced to 50 liters, and that's a quantifiable standard, and you claim that the sprinkler doesn't work and can use like a sprayer or something like that. So would that see that at a higher or lower requirements vis-a-vis? And what you outline your three defense that allow you to vary the FSD. Well, I see this good thing. At least you get some leeway. Well, if you claim that you have relaxing requirements, well, it claims they are not able. Well, you see it's already relaxed. Was that a reasonable ground? Well, you have to choose a more expensive option. At least I'm giving you a way out. So is it by the time we legislated, if 100 doesn't work, you have to do with 20,000? Are you authorized to do it this way? I have reservations. I know I'm summing up from the lessons from CAPS 572. I see it could be just finer details. Is there any way that you can make it clearer? It's just you can't for authority manager as instead of saying that just trust me. Very often we trust the administration like that, but that would be criticized by the public. So I wonder, can the administration and can reconcile our positions? Well, instead of higher or lower, but a lower requirement as per Schedule 1 and 2, where it's difficult to comply with. Okay, so can you just consider other alternative measures so that the owner or the occupier as time evolved, there are new hardware available that will allow to achieve the similar result. Well, even though James Stowe claims that even though it might achieve the same effect, but that it will cost a lot of money, whereas you think it was easier, actually it could be cost prohibitive. Well, it's mass production that will be cheaper to able to use at the old buildings for those about to be demolished. They have to calculate the loading and all the design, and then requiring the building. Well, the building's going to be pulled down anyway, so why do we have to put money there anyway? So one administration would like to supplement. Okay, let me explain on two levels. In terms of the provisions, like Mr. Cho said, can you outline other alternative measures? Would you make any unreasonable demands? The provisions offer some protection or restrict the powers of the EAs. So when we issued an FSD, it had to be reasonable. And for Clause 7, if this is not unreasonable, we have to take other measures. Take the 572, for example. Well, if a building have a structure or a space layout issue, let's say they're not able to comply with the basic requirements on water tank as per the 1994. So maybe what we request become unreasonable. Therefore, we allow alternative measures to compliance. So, for example, we will reduce the volume requirement for the water tanks from the 4,500 liters, reduce to just 500 liters. And for 500 liters, for us, we're well aware that it can be handled by the building structure. So that's be a actual example in practice. Chairman, maybe for the majority of the bill is good. If as a particular case, well, so when you claim it unreasonable in the case of JR, that will be regarded as safe in the spirit of the law. If I'm not able to comply with the requirement, it only costs $100 and force them to take on a $20,000 equipment. I wonder if the ending outcome is still safe from the safety point of view. So we can both do some thinking. So maybe I can impose some criteria. How about the legal advisor can help if she have any insight? I see is reasonable, and is well. And you can't just include express provision to account for all possibilities. I think the administration understand Mr. Cho's concern, which is stemmed from, which I see as an unreasonable request, or the other provisions in this bill have offered any check and balances. For example, for the can we do something on their assessing the reasonableness? As for the committee have also looked into these things, which so how do we assure Mr. Cho so that he won't be concerned that the government would unreasonably create a huge excessive difficulty for owner occupied and compliant with requirements? Legal advisor, do you have anything to add? Nothing. Mr. Wu? So in Cap 572, all the occupiers or the owners, when they want to make themselves heard, they could do so on a case-by-case basis to Mr. Zhang. Well, and for the whole procedure, we need to have authorized persons to point out that which part of the FSD could not be complied with. On that basis, they can apply to the FSD or the EAs to seek alternative measures. In this case, let me clarify. Well, let's say as an owner, I received the FSD. I think I'm not able to comply with it. Can I discuss it directly with the FSD instead of seeking the AP to look for alternative measures? So what kind of persons do we allow to discuss with the EAs all the alternative measures and their appropriateness? For this kind of installation, well, frankly, it's just a matter of compliance at what cost. Well, are you willing to pay more? The requirements can be met. Is there any cost condition in for us to decide whether an FSD is reasonable or not? This upsurge in cost, would that become a assessment consideration criteria? Well, the cost upsurge will come in two fronts. Well, the requirement itself led to the increase in cost. Well, taking reference from CAPS 572, what we saw is that the market changes had led to a cost surge. Can the administration explain how do we balance, or that due to the enactment of the bill that led to the jump in cost and actually even led to collusion in the marketplace. So will the cost, would the case officer consider the cost implications, Mr. Chung? When the owner occupier would welcome them to liaise directly with the case officer. For example, even if the coordination among owners require our assistance, we're happy to help. But please also pay attention that for the IBs concerned might be different from domestic buildings. We have briefly looked at the IBs to be regulated. Most of them have the fire hydrant, hose and reel, and the sprinklers. Thus, the buildings, regardless of the size of water, they still have a water tank regardless of their size. So in terms of there will be less technical and spatial challenge. If the owner required the case officer assistance, feel free to contact us. And Mr. Wu also mentioned about cost. We've done some cost feasibility study. Well, the cost could go up and down in the market. Well, depends on the affordability and the cost. We see that the economic efficiency is higher. I, of course, understand that for the IBs to comply with the requirements, it will be easier. However, this doesn't apply to CAP 7.2. Well, this is the problem faced by the private domestic blocks and Chinese tenement buildings. I wonder if it is a matter of a provision. Well, this is quite similar, but not identical to CAP 572. For this proposed arrangement, can it apply to, can it be transported to CAP 572 or only modified slightly so that the small homeowners who is facing more problems than the IBs well, they have a greater difficulty in complying with the requirement. I was seeking alternative measures. Of course, you learn from CAP 7.2, thus you're making some adjustment. But on the other hand, can you also apply the same provision under CAP 572 to private domestic buildings? Mr. Chung? Well, for this FSIB bill, before while learning from the enforcement of the CAP 7.2, we also took reference to the CAP 502, the Fire Safety Commercial Premise Ordinance. The compliance rate as of today, about 70% of the commercial buildings have fulfilled the FSD. So that's the experience we gained.
Mr. Wu asked whether we would also put these relevant clauses under CAP 575. I can tell you that we are looking into methods to help those owners and occupiers. For example, we have been taking a more flexible approach. For example, for 4 to 6 story residential and commercial buildings, we can see that people are worried about water tanks and also on the fire hoses. We are trying to set it to a smaller water tank of around 500 liters. So these are ways in which we are trying to help owners and occupiers comply with fire standards and to ensure that it would not affect the structural integrity of the building. I would like to share with you some numbers. After we have adopted these measures, we have seen 90% of the 4 to 6 story buildings applying to arrange for a smaller water tank. So these are examples in which we can help owners and occupiers comply with the fire safety standards and requirements. I'll also like to ask about the fire safety requirements under CAP 575 because sometimes there may be discrepancies between those requirements and those of the buildings department. So does it mean that with this bill in place, then it would not appear in the industrial buildings? Well, we are both enforcement authorities, and I have explained in previous meetings that these two EAs would work hand in hand in joint inspection. Therefore, both parties would know of the standards and can work together to ensure that the owners and occupiers comply with both sets of standards and requirements. Thank you, Chairman. Well, in that case, I support the idea of joint inspection, but you don't have this concept under CAP 572. Therefore, if you do have this principle in place, it can really help the owners and occupiers to alleviate many problems. So can this principle also be adopted in other buildings? I hope that we can try to focus on the bill here today, and I do ask the administration to go back to look at policy issues. Well, you have raised your point. I'm sure they have heard you. We have been deviating from the topic a bit. I'm sure you raised this because you hope that the administration will also take this into consideration for other buildings. But I would like to ask you to come back to the bill today. Mrs. Liu, yes, a brief response. Yes, we are working on this. CAP 572 also has this joint inspection in place. All right, let us continue. Thank you, Chairman. We have already gone through Clause 7 and Clause 8. Clause 8, the legal advisor would like to say a few words on Clause 8. Thank you, Chairman. So when we were discussing clause 7, we also did mention clause 8, and I would like to draw members' attention to the time limit stated in clause 8. The fire safety direction must specify the time limit for compliance, and the time limit must allow reasonable time for compliance. The administration has also briefly explained clause 8 just now, and in the written response, has also stated that under clause 8, the fire safety direction can be extended in time limit. So I would like to ask about how you could enforce this. Perhaps administration can try to explain it to members like this. Would the enforcement authority proactively raise an extension? We see from the administration's response that if the owner or occupier have reasonable, then extension could be granted on a case-by-case basis. So I want to know when an extension could be granted. Well, if the owner and occupier need to talk about compliance, and they need to apply for an extension, let's say the time limit is almost due, or that the time has already expired. Under these circumstances, what considerations would the EA look into in their granting of extension? Well, this has not been stated very clearly in the actual operation or adoption of this clause. So can you try to explain this to us further? Mr. Zhang. Thank you, Chairman. Well, we can look at this issue from two perspectives. First of all, we would consider the time needed to install all the fire safety equipment. If it is something very simple, then we would only allow a short period of time. And if it is very complicated, then we would allow a longer period of time. During the required works, if there's any situation, the owner and occupier can apply for an extension. And so the owner and occupier must give or demonstrate a reason for the extension. Maybe they will need time to select the consultants and contractors, or maybe they're still in discussion with the contractors on what kind of requirements to be put in place. So these can be applied on a case-by-case basis. So you're just afraid that people would abuse this clause, am I right? legal advisor. Well, let's say the owner and occupier are looking into complying with the standards, yet the time frame given is already very close to due date. As any non-compliance would be an offense. The owner and occupier might not have enough time to apply for the extension. So what role would the case officer play in that case? Can you further explain this? Thank you, Chairman. Let me use the example of the owner and occupier applying for an extension because of using other relevant factors. If we find there is a need, then we would extend the time limit. We do not hope that people will have the opportunity to abuse the system. If the reason given is not appropriate, then we would not allow the extension. All right, thank you. Thank you. Moving down to Clause 9, amending or withdrawing fire safety direction. As we have mentioned earlier, we foresee that the enforcement authority may from time to time amend or withdraw it by written notice. All right, please continue. Clause 10. When fire safety direction ceases to be in force. 10A. It will cease to be in force if a certificate of compliance is issued for the building or part. B. The enforcement authority withdraws the direction under Section 9. After discussion on both sides, they find that they do not need to continue with the direction, then the EA can withdraw the direction. And C, the direction is replaced by a fire safety compliance order that the magistrate has given out a fire safety compliance order. And so that direction would be thus replaced by the compliance order. And this case will then be continued by the compliance order. Clause 11. The offense with not complying with fire safety direction. 11(1) states that an owner or occupier of a building or a part of a building who without reasonable excuse fails to comply with a fire safety direction for the building or part commits an offense. Bracket 2 states out the conviction that if a person commits such an offense, it will be liable to a fine at level 4 and a further fine of $2,500 for each day. We would also consider the time limit for complying with the fire safety direction, and the fine of $2,500 per day will continue until it is complied with. We would also consider the structural integrity of building and on the technology required for compliance. Therefore, there can be a reasonable excuse for not complying if these two cases come into place.
咁咧就係
For the advisory committee, that'll be the composition. The CAP 502 and 572 and 702, they have a similar advisory committee. For clause 12.1, the advisory committee can advise the authority on what kind of opinion. Or let's say if they can direct the owner or occupier of a building or part of the building to take other appropriate measures under section 7, and if so, what measures would be appropriate? The advisory committee play a consultative role to the EAs. So the 12(1), so that it will be set up upon the passage of this bill? Yes. We anticipated that it will be made up with the relevant experts to sit on this advisory committee. And for 2, you claim that it should be persons with relevant expertise. On the composition of this advisory committee, do you have any initial ideas? And what do you mean by with relevant expertise? Did you mean that you are familiar with fire safety or fire installation? Or that those engineers who work in that field? Thank you, Chairman. Okay, I will let Mr. Chung to explain from CAP 572 and 702. So that will be set up in a similar manner. For the FSIB Advisory Committee, I believe that the composition will be similar to the 572 and 702. Under 572, what kind of persons will be the members? Will come to the academics, the engineering field, the fire engineering surveying. We also invite other professional bodies, for example, the relevant institutes. Well, currently, we also accept recommendations from the district office with those with relevant engineering and professional experience. So this advisory committee will take reference from the 2 ordinances. Well, this advisory committee should have been set up upon the passage of this bill. So the government already have an idea on the composition, but how about on the number of members sitting on it? So I think we're all concerned. Well, they have a similar ACs that provide professional advice to made up of experts. I think you can supply more information. Well, let me make a correction. Well, they have an AC committee under 572 since 502 is the oldest set of legislation, so we don't have an AC under it. I just want to put it on record. For under 572, the advisory committee, the membership composition, we can supply to the meeting bill committee afterwards. Carry on. So the enforcement authority, where is see fit, it will refer cases to the advisory committee. However, for the next point, we're at the AC also invite representations from the owner or the occupier and consider them before advising on the case. And for point 5, it made it clear that if advisory committee have advice on a case, the EA must consider the advice. So that the views of the AC views must be considered by the EA during enforcement. Here it claims that only the EA can refer to a case to the advisory committee. Well, that I understand. Well, would the EA decided not to refer the cases to the AC? Let's say we never made any case referrals, then the owner occupier may lose the opportunity to be heard. Can you explain, Mr. Zhang? The way it's written, I believe that there were lots of cases require referral, or even for the number of buildings involved. Well, under every CIB, there are over 1,000 IBs concerned. Therefore, we don't want the owner occupier abusing the mechanism. So it was written that the EA must refer a case. However, the owner or occupier have other channels to consider alternative measures. And like the actual operation of 572, very often we see that there are proactive referrals of plenty of cases to the AC. So what factors do you consider in making referrals? Well, let's say if we have a similar cases, then you'll refer to the AC to seek the advice. So what other factors are there? Let's say you set up the advisory committee, is that you want to tap on the expertise of the members for a more independent opinion. However, what justifications does the administration have in deciding to make referrals or not? Otherwise, just a advisory committee would not be in actual active operation. Let's say besides having some measures that we can help the similar batch of cases, for individual cases, if they are unique, if technically the administration see that need to seek the professional advice of the committee. For example, the new technologies and new equipment which will help the enforcement of this bill. Then we'll refer them to the advisory committee and hope that they can render their advice that how it should work. If you have other considerations, I hope that you can offer consolidated, include it in your consolidated response after the meeting. I think that this advisory committee can play a certain role, and they also take reference from 572 operations. So I see that the members may be interested in knowing more about this committee. Let's continue. Next, we move on to Division 2 on Fire Safety Compliance Order. Clause 13 is stated at when will the magistrate make the Fire Safety Compliance Order, FSCO. In 3, explain that when the EA found that the FSD have not observed and violate 11.1, they can apply to a red magistrate to make a FSCO in order to owner the occupier to comply with any requirement measures specified in the FSD. And under 13.2, is set out that the owner occupier is entitled to be heard at the hearing of the application of the actual circumstances. And the relevant FSCO must order to specify the time limit for compliance, and 13.4 illustrate that the time limit must be allow reasonable time for compliance. 13.5 conceptually, when an FSCO have been issued, it will be replaced at the FSD issued earlier. Then it will monitor the discharge of the FSCO. For 13.3, for the FSCO, for the time limit specified, would you propose to the magistrate, since you're the one familiar with this? So that will be for the magistrate's consideration. Yes, we'll propose that. And for clause 14, there's a mechanism similar to FSCO, so that the magistrate may vary or make an order to revoke the FSCO. Well, like I said, the EAs and the owners and occupiers, even when get to the FSCO, will still communicate on the feasibility and the time limit. Thus, the 14.1. So we have a mechanism to ensure that the FSCO contents can be varied or revoked. In 14.2, explained the EAs and the owner occupier are entitled to be heard at the hearing of the application. Next, 15. When the CFR FSCO will cease to be enforced. Let's say when a certificate of compliance is issued for the building or part of it, it means that the measures have been taken, and therefore it will no longer need to be enforced.
裁判官
And if the magistrate revokes the order under Section 14, that it has by revoking the fire safety compliance order, then the compliance order ceases to be enforced as well. Bracket 2. States that the enforcement authority must, as soon as practicable, A. Give written notification to the magistrate's clerk that a certificate of compliance has been issued. So that the authorities would know that the compliance has already been complied with. And B, must serve on the owner-occupier a copy of the notification as well. Clause 16. Mr. Wu Chi-wei. Sorry. Oh, if the magistrate can revoke the order, I want to try to understand under what circumstance the magistrate can revoke the order. Well, would the magistrate have already revoked the order because it has to do with the time frame, and maybe the order has already been complied with before it goes up to the magistrate's court? Thank you. Or an example would be an enforcement authority going for a site inspection, and we find that everything has been complied with, then we would notify the magistrate as soon as possible that a certificate of compliance has been issued, and the magistrate would then revoke the order. So that would be the only condition. Well, usually yes, but Section 14 also states that the owner and occupier are also entitled to be heard at the hearing of the application. Now, let's say they believe that I have already complied with all the conditions, and so they're entitled to be heard at the hearing of the application, but it's up to the magistrate. Well, I should put it this way. An order has been made. The owner and occupier have already begun works, yet the EA is not satisfied, and so the magistrate would need to interfere. Am I understanding this correctly? Well, if the owner and occupier have already completed with the compliance, then we would issue a certificate of compliance. I don't think what you have stated would happen, because we would issue a certificate of compliance as soon as possible so that the magistrate can revoke the order. Let us continue. Thank you, Chairman. Moving on to Clause 16 on not complying with fire safety compliance. The owner or occupier of a building or a part of a building who fails to comply with the fire safety compliance order for the building or part commits an offense. This person would be liable on conviction to a fine at level 5, and so level 5 would be $50,000. And similar to the previous clause on fire safety requirements, the person who commits such an offense would also be liable to a further fine of $5,000 for each day during which the failure continues after the expiry of the time limit. Chairman, I would like to ask another question, if I may. Oh, when I want to try to understand about the time frame, because it's all up to when the EAs sends a notice to the magistrate. Do you have a time limit on that? So when a fire safety direction has been issued, so the owner and occupier will need to complete the compliance within a certain time period. Well, I think we discussed this earlier. I'm sorry I wasn't here just now. Mr. Zhang, can you explain it further? Well, we would look at the case on an individual basis to see how much time would be needed to comply with the fire safety direction, and then we would give this a recommendation to the magistrate, and then the magistrate would make a decision on how much time would be needed to comply with these standards. All right, so the fire safety direction would be issued and then if the owner and occupier do not comply by the time frame, then the magistrate will make an order, perhaps being 3 months or 6 months, requiring the owner and occupier to comply within a certain time frame. Am I correct? Well, yes, basically yes, Mr. Zhang. Perhaps you can explain this further. Well, yes, so this is the general arrangement. However, I have to point out that we would only apply for a fire safety compliance order when the owner and occupier have not complied with clause 11. All right, if there are no other questions on this, we would move on to the prohibition order. Thank you, Chairman. Division 3, prohibition order. So this would be issued by the district court. An enforcement authority may apply to the district court for a prohibition order for a building or a part of a building if the authority considers that a requirement or measure specified in a fire safety direction or in a fire safety compliance order for the building or part has not been complied with by an owner or occupier of the building or part. An application may only be made after the expiry of the time limit for complying with the fire safety direction or the fire safety compliance order. An enforcement authority must give at least 7 days' notice to the owner or occupier before making the application. Under 17(4), the enforcement authority must post a copy of the notice at a conspicuous place inside the building or part or in the immediate vicinity of each entrance to the building or part so that people walking by would be able to see this notice. I would like an explanation on the prohibition order. My understanding is that we hope the industrial buildings could enhance their fire safety measures and that they all comply with the latest standards. some of them have already complied with the basic requirements and they only need to upgrade their safety measures. Well, we hope that the industrial buildings would enhance their fire safety measures. Well, even if they do not make any enhancements, they are still considered safe, am I right? So why would you need to apply for a prohibition order? Chairman, I think your question can be answered by reading clause 18. Because it states when a prohibition order should be made. And it is up to safety issues. May I refer you to clause 18 bracket 2. There are 4 scenarios that need to be complied with before making the prohibition order. 1. The owner or occupier of the building or part has failed to comply with the requirement or measures specified in the fire safety direction or in the fire safety compliance order. Second, it is reasonable to expect the owner or occupier to comply with the requirement or measure. Thirdly, the time allowed for complying with the requirement or measure is reasonable. And fourth, that it is reasonable and necessary in the circumstances to make the order. And fifth, there are substantial fire risks if the building or part is occupied. There will not be too many such cases. What you have raised, Chairman, is correct because most of the industrial buildings have already complied with the most basic fire safety standards. Therefore, the majority of them would only need to make enhancement measures. But we do not want to rule out the possibility that for some buildings, if no measures are taken, it might pose a substantial risk, and we would then apply for a prohibition order. And the effect of prohibition order is listed out in clause 19. That no person may occupy the building or part except a person with a permission granted or an authorized officer acting in the course of duty. Therefore, we do not want the public suffering because the owner and occupier did not comply with the fire safety directions. Well, I understand this. You're only looking into enhancements of fire safety measures. So people understand that the building is safe. But in clause 18, you mentioned that there may be substantial fire risk if the building or part is occupied, and if that is the case, then you would immediately apply for a prohibition order. So the buildings right now actually are being used and occupied. But do you mean that if there is substantial fire risk, you will not allow the building to be used or occupied? Because it is already being in use. So when would you see the scenario stated under bracket E? So would you use E to ensure that the owner and occupier would comply. Can you try to explain this further? Maybe Mr. Zheng can take this question. Thank you, Chairman. This is a very rare situation. If we look at under Cap 572 and 502, we have a similar clause, but the enforcement authorities have never used that to make a prohibition order. So I would like members to take note of that. Well, but for the other scenarios, that if they do not comply with a requirement or measure within the time allowed, then it's mainly a pecuniary penalty. What we hope to do here is to enhance the fire safety standard.
So it will only be invoked in very rare circumstances. Under what situation do we see that? Well, when we see a building as having a huge fire hazard, for example, during inspection, we ask them to upgrade their fire installation facilities, and they refused, and it will be put the public at risk if they enter the building. Let's say the fire service equipment, they would comply with the prevailing legislation. However, during our inspection, it found that it was broken, does not maintained, or even dismantled, which would lead to a huge fire hazard, or structure-wise, it would in disrepair, not able to comply with this. FSCO or the owner have failed to conduct repair and maintenance work. So under the powers granted in this bill, we can apply to the district court magistrate for a prohibition order. I must stress that this is a very exceptionally rare circumstances and has never been invoked in the past two ordinances, 572 and 502. Well, I noted this from the fire hazard point of view. I think the fire officer had been empowered to eliminate this fire hazard. So why include this provision in this bill? If the building haven't done anything, it just wants to upgrade the fire installation, it should be regarded as safe. Okay, let's say you assume you have to comply with a condition A to E before you can apply for a prohibition order. I see there's a huge problem with E. I see that they will not get to the point where you cannot enter the building. If you have been given power through other legislation, why should you include this? And actually, it's quite time-consuming to initiate the process. Since this huge fire risk must be eliminated ASAP, otherwise there might cause fatality. If you insert this into this bill, it seems to be quite indirect route of pursuing. What if they keep on ignoring the orders? I'm sure that you can. Let's say a magistrate had order have been disregarded and without reasonable explanation. I'm sure you can invoke other penalties to ensure they take up the responsibility. I know Mr. Yu has a question. You had explained earlier, but why invoke this in this bill if it rarely enforced or don't plan to be invoked, then why do you include it here? Well, the moment it was we issued an FSD, and then we disregard, then we escalate it by applying to a magistrate for an FSCO. These are all linked together. That already have a basis of a case. And then I'll apply a prohibition order to the court. Then it will be smooth since we are taking it step by step. When can I comply the FSD and the FSCO, then we can achieve the results quickly so that the unsafe buildings will be barred from entry. Yes, the chairman is correct. The FSD can invoke other provisions to achieve a similar effect. Since we are going through the step and we are providing you a way to cover any unforeseen scenarios, which I see is more preferred. Thus, we choose to include this possible solution in the bill. Like Assistant Director Zhang said, from past experience, it rarely happened. However, we feel that if it would provide this possibility in the provision that allowed it to be more comprehensive and effective. So can you supplement after the meeting? So what is the time taken and the procedures under a different set of laws? I have to convince members for you to include this in this bill. Well, of course, more the better, but is it really worth it? Since the prohibition order, if should be included in this bill, I would see further explanation is needed, especially where property ownership is concerned. So why do you consider other penalties for further incompliance? Which I see this PO is effective. However, 0.5 is very hard to prove. I don't see there's a really connection with the FSCO or the FSD either. Well, you have asked a question on my behalf, which I hope to understand. Well, as the last silver bullet of the FSCO, as I know this is silver bullet, let's say you have a very naughty occupier, not afraid of being fined, then you resort to this. By the time you deploy the silver bullet, they can always claim that whether there are substantial fire hazard risk as a defense. Well, we have a fire bullet and you have to prove that the substantial fire hazard. Let's say a very naughty person for a long time, you're not able to make them comply, and then when you finally use your silver bullet, you still allow them to use other excuse to drag on. Would that be reasonable? I have doubt on this. Should we deliberately make the owner or the occupier to give them a way out? Since this huge substantial fire hazard, like I share with the chairman of the confusion, where does the substantial fire risk come about? And yet it can choose not to comply with the requirements. For example, the removal of the fire service equipment is a very outrageous case. This is probably not something covered by this bill. if the fire safety installation have been removed from the building, well, maybe it have been caught in the inspection instead of resorting to this. Let me explain that when this prohibition order is a silver bullet, and then I'll defer to Mr. Zhang to explain under what circumstances that we need to file a prohibition order. Well, the main effect of the PO is to bar the public from entering the building. We're not requesting to expedite the works. That's not the idea. Well, according to the FSCO mechanism, will be negotiate with them to hope that they can start the work ASAP. For the PO, we can see it must be warranted by a substantial fire hazard risk. Since the contents of the PO is about barring the public from entering, you can see there's no provisions in the PO to expedite the relevant works. Well, actually, you bar the owner occupier from entry, they actually infringe of their right of using the building, and which indirectly motivate them to expedite the work. This is an indirect result. However, this is not expressly required in the provision. And for the various scenarios, I'll defer to Mr. Zhang. Okay, let me illustrate through an example that in what circumstances would constitute a substantial fire hazard. For that industry building, let's say they had complied with the fire safety requirement and deemed safe. However, when we mandate to carry out improvement works, for example, they removed the fire safety installation, but have yet to reinstall them, and we see some pain. For example, let's say for a building carry out maintenance for the lift shaft, they have altered the layout. Let's say they removed the original fire safety installation, and since we installed the new SI, they have added shafts between floors. However, for a long time there will be delay in the works. Well, with the passage of this bill, the works delay that was deemed safe now, but then deprived of the basic fire safety facilities, and yet the occupier have been dragged on and not able to complete the works. In this way, the EA will deem that it will be a huge fire hazard risk for the public to enter the building. Under such extreme circumstances, we will apply a PO to the district court. So they still explain the condition A to E. Since yes, you carry out improvement works, and yes, work is suspended indefinitely, would pose a huge fire hazard risk, such as barring the public from entering. For fulfilling condition A to E, I see that it will not be abused. That will not bar them public entry due to other circumstances. For the time limit, well, since for point E, so how much time will be given? Well, since the hazard is considered an urgency to be addressed. Let's continue, shall we? So right now we touch lightly on clause 19 on the effect of a PO.
款呢寫得好清。
19 bracket 1 states very clearly that no person may occupy the building with the prohibition order except persons with a permission granted or an authorized officer acting in the course of duty. (19) 3 also states that the enforcement authority may cancel the permission at any time. (19) 4 requests that while a prohibition order is in force, the owner and occupier of the building or part must take all practicable measures to ensure the building or part is effectively secured against entry by other persons. Please continue. Clause 20. Discharging prohibition order. 20(1) If a prohibition order is in force for a building or a part of a building, the enforcement authority must, as soon as practicable, after issuing a certificate of compliance for the building or part, apply to the district court for discharge of the order. So, because you will not need the prohibition order after it has been complied with. Bracket 2, the application must be accompanied by a copy of the certificate of compliance for reference. Bracket 3, and this would be in very rare circumstances that the district court must on the application make an order to discharge the prohibition order unless it considers that there are special grounds for not doing so. The authority lies with the district court. But it would be very rare because usually a copy of the certificate of compliance would be sent to the district court. Clause 21, revoking prohibition order. 21(1)(a) says that if a prohibition order is in force, the enforcement authority rejects a request for a certificate of compliance made under Section 26(1) for the building or part by the owner or occupier concerned. The owner-occupier may apply to the district court for an order to revoke the prohibition order. Or if the enforcement authority fails to issue a certificate of compliance for the building or part within 20 days after the date on which the owner-occupier concerned gives a notice, the owner-occupier may apply to the district court for an order to revoke the prohibition order as well. But the applicant must, within 7 days after making the application, give written notice of the application by delivering it personally or sending it by post to the enforcement authority. The enforcement authority is entitled to be heard at the hearing of the application so that the district court can make its decision. And the court may make any order it considers appropriate at the hearing of the application as stated under clause 21(4). Thank you, Chairman. Please continue. Clause 22, validity period of prohibition order. A prohibition order for a building or a part of a building comes into force if the owner-occupier concerned does not appeal against the order, which is on the 29th day after the date on which the order is served on the owner or occupier, or if the owner or occupier appeals against the order on the day following the date on which the appeal is finally rejected or is withdrawn. However, the district court may, if it considers appropriate in a particular case, order that a prohibition order comes into force on the date on which a copy of the prohibition order is served on the owner or occupier concerned, or on a date within 28 days after the date of service, so that there can be more flexibility for the district court. A prohibition order ceases to be enforced on the earliest of the discharge of the order under Section 20, or the revocation of the order under Section 21, or 3, this is quite special, if the building or part ceases to exist. Well, for C, you state that the building or part ceasing to exist. So what is the consideration behind that? Does that mean the prohibition order will continue to be in effect if the owner and occupier do not take any action? Yes, because the prohibition order would prohibit people entering the premises. And so the fire safety standard and compliance order would continue to be in place. And we would request the owner and occupier to take action. Well, however, if the building is torn down and it ceases to exist, then the prohibition order will not continue to be enforced. Also, would there be a penalty? Yes, there will be a penalty on a day-to-day basis. Well, it would be very difficult actually for the government to recover this penalty. So the owner and occupier would need to pay the penalty if they do not comply. Mr. Wu Chi-wai, I'd like to ask about bracket 2, that the district court may, if it considers appropriate in a particular case, order that a prohibition order comes into force. What do you mean by a particular case? Mrs. Liu? Usually, by our calculations, the order must be served before the 29th day. We may see that some cases that it poses a huge danger to the public, that the district court believes that you cannot wait till the 29th day. And so the district court will have the flexibility under this clause that if necessary, then the prohibition order can come into force on an earlier day. Well, so this is linked with the prohibition order. So can you actually clarify that the court will only consider it appropriate when there is a serious or substantial fire risk? Mrs. Liu, oh yes, safety, of course, is one of the most important concepts. However, the district court will also hear both parties. we cannot rule out the possibility that the district court may have considered the circumstances raised by the occupier and owner. And if the district court finds it reasonable, and also the enforcement authorities may have also given their reasons. The district court will consider both sides, and if it finds it appropriate, then the prohibition order can come into force. We do not want to make it clear that the district court would only consider safety issues. We want to give it the flexibility. Well, I'm asking about this because in clause 18 we have A to E, and we're most concerned with substantial fire risk because these terms used seem to be very relaxed. Or if the building poses a huge fire risk, then the district court should issue a prohibition order. I really cannot think of anything that could override the importance of substantial fire risk. Would the prohibition order have considered all other aspects? And you're just actually setting the date on which the order comes into force. Well, West, I'm worried about it because under clause 18 bracket E, you say that you would make a prohibition order if there is substantial fire risk. I myself believe that this is the most important factor to consider. Well, I'm not sure, but maybe there are other factors that may be considered by the district court on the effective day. Well, we are just actually raising examples here. Let's say for a certain building, it comes into force on the 29th day. Maybe the authorities believe that it should be enforced at an earlier date. But the owner or occupier may ask the district court to consider that they would need a longer time for compliance. So the district court would not only consider fire hazards, the court will also consider the factors raised by the owner and occupier before setting a date on which the prohibition order will come into force. So now we believe it appropriate to allow the district court to consider all factors from both parties before ordering when the prohibition order comes into force. I just want to clarify, Chairman. I hope that I'm understanding this correctly. If you look at how it is written here, basically talking about a date within 28 days. But for bracket 2, bracket A, you said on the date on which a copy of the prohibition order is served on the owner or occupier concerned. if you do not make this clear, then you're just saying that the order given by the district court would be less than 29 days, within 28 days. So I really do not understand how the owner-occupier would be able to request for a later date. Well, yes, here it said that we are requesting the district court to order a date within 28 days. But the district court will not only consider the requests made by the EAs. We word it like this so that the district court will not only consider fire safety, because there could be a hearing for this application, and we want to allow the occupier and owner to give their reasons as well. So if we use the term consider appropriate, then the district court can balance the considerations on both sides. Because if we only put down the consideration of fire safety, then the district court will not be able to balance all factors. And the decision would not be made based on both sides. Well, I think our time is up today. I think we should adjourn our meeting, or we can follow up at the next meeting. Our next meeting will be on April 2nd, Tuesday, 10:45 in the morning. If there is no AOB, I now adjourn the meeting. Thank you.